going to start now. Thank you all for coming. This is the June 9th Planning Committee meeting. With me is, on the committee, is Roxanne Murphy and Jean Knutson. And we have one item this morning to discuss. It is a continuing work session on a rental safety program, a residential rental safety program. And we, since our last discussion a couple weeks ago, we have had a couple things. One is some changes to an ordinance that was presented in the initial package. And there is another option that has been submitted, and we'll get a presentation on that as well. And so I think what I'll do is I'll give it over to Jeff to speak about any other housekeeping things, and then we can go into the individual presentations after that. So, Jeff?
Sure. Thanks, Jack. Jeff Thomas with Planning. Joining me at the staff tables, in addition to the mayor, are City Attorney Peter Raffato, as well as Building Official Jim Tinner, and then Council Policy Analyst Mark Gardner is at the podium. The agenda bill that is part of this week's packet, there are 4 attachments, and Jack just touched on, generally speaking, what they're all about. But just for the public's information, we've got 4 attachments. The first 2 pertain to the committee's direction from May 19th, which was to take the initial draft ordinance that the mayor had staff prepare to guide the committee in your discussions and make a select number of amendments to it. Peter has done that, and in addition to that, as he advised you at the last committee meeting, there are also some other housekeeping type amendments that Peter went ahead and changed. So those amendments are captured in the first attachment to the agenda bill, which is a memorandum from Peter. Peter's going to walk you through that here in a minute. And then there's also a revised copy of the draft ordinance, a clean copy, which was included in the council packet. Additionally, Peter had sent out a track changes version to the council via email late last week, so you should have received that as well for reference. The other 2 attachments to the agenda bill are from Mark, and those relate to, as Jack just mentioned, I guess we're commonly referring to as option 5, and there's some information on that in the 3rd attachment, and then there's also a FSCO note that Mark had prepared, and I believe he will present those 2 attachments to you as soon as Peter runs through the revisions to that draft ordinance as directed by the committee on May 19th. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, and he'll walk you through the memorandum and essentially the changes to that draft ordinance.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you, Jeff. So the only thing I would add to the housekeeping element is that there are some track changes copies on the table there at the entrance, so that's available as well. And I also, in addition to sending those out to council, I sent it out to a couple citizens that had requested a track changes version.
One second. Did you guys get a hard copy of the track changes?
No, it was by email.
Oh, yeah. We got it by email. Is it possible that we could, if there's enough copies of those, that we can get them up here too? Not anymore?
I read it. I don't need it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all right.
Thanks, Kathy.
Can we get some more?
Okay.
Okay, so in addition to that, what I want to do is there's a memo that goes through bullet by bullet each of the change. I don't necessarily want to go through each of those. As Jeff mentioned, there are the changes that were made based on the council's motion, as well as some technical changes that I made, but I wanted to go through the highlights of those. Starting with, and I'm just going to refer to the draft ordinance as it is in the packet in terms of the page number. This is a council packet, page number 92. The name of the program was changed to Residential Safety Program.
Excuse me, Peter. Actually, something happened during the transcription of last meeting, but there was an agreement by Jean, who is the maker of the motion, that it was actually being called the Residential Rental Safety Program.
That's fine, that's easily changed.
It's easy enough to change, but it had already been kind of dealt with at that point, but
Okay. The second change is on page 93, or the second substantive change, I would say, is on page 93. Again, a change under the purpose section of the name of the program, and I'll just go ahead and make that correction as you just indicated. The next change I'd like to refer to is on page 95 of the packet. It's under scope. This is where we get into a council motion that identified which types of housing types would be exempt from the program. And the council's motion was to include a number of housing types as types that would have to register, but that would not have to pay a fee and would not be subject to a certificate of inspection. So under scope, you'll find that a number of items that were totally exempted, a number of housing types that were totally exempted are not, they've been moved down to be exempt under fees. So 1 through 8 under scope, continuing on to page 96 of the packet, that has been changed to reflect that. Additionally, on page 96 of the packet, under B, standards for declaration of compliance. One of the things that we wanted to make sure of is that it's clear that the nature of any inspection or declaration of compliance is limited to those items that could endanger, that would impair or could endanger or impair the health or safety of a tenant, so that it's not addressing cosmetic conditions. And there was a change made to make that more clear. Still starting on page 96 of the packet under fee, so now we're down to B. It says the fee for registration. No fee for registration shall be required for a number of properties. Those were properties that were basically moved from exempt status down to exempt from fee, and that was based on the council's motion. And those include owner-occupied buildings containing 2 units or less, certain rental units that a government unit or agency operates or manages, and then certain rental units that receive funding or subsidies from the government, and then there are a number of elements that have to be met in order for them to be exempt from the fee. And then finally, accessory dwelling units when the owner resides in either the single-family residence or the ADU. Still on page 96 of the packet, one housekeeping change under application. Before we had identified the city's business licensing program as the place where this would all occur when a landlord wanted to register a property. This really identifies that it's going to be on a form and process established by the director. I think the intent right now is to use the city's current permitting process, but this just leaves it open because I don't think it's necessary to identify that exactly right now. On page 98 of the packet, under display of registration, the change was made per council motion that a laminated copy would be posted on the inside of the front door of each residential housing unit. Starting on page 98 of the packet, under I, declaration of compliance, and continuing on, I inserted a word in that, the word presented, and I'll read that in context so it's clear. That the declaration of compliance has to use the standards identified in the ordinance and also state that there are no conditions presented in the units that endanger or impair or could endanger or impair the health or safety of a tenant. There had been concerns raised, I think, both internally to the city and externally that without that word or something like it, there could be a latent condition that no one could have observed. It's only if the condition is presented that there's that obligation to locate it and identify it. We're still on page 99 of the packet under certificates of inspection. At the bottom of A, 6.15050A, it refers back to those units that were identified as exempt from the fee as units that will be exempt from certificates of inspection, and that is per the council's motion. Continuing on page 99, under B, the word presented was also inserted in the same language when we're talking about a certificate of inspection to account for the possibility of a latent condition, and this is really just to balance out the concerns about safety with having a reasonable scope of inspection. Continuing on to page 100 of the packet, under C, there's a change made that when the director is authorized to add standards to the checklist, it's only standards that are consistent with the intent and scope of this chapter. Remember, the scope of this chapter is only as to certain serious safety issues or health and safety of the tenant. So it's clear that the director is limited in his or her authority in that respect. Page 102 of the packet, as the council directed, I'm looking at H now, the fee to be assessed for a city council building code officer to conduct an inspection under this chapter, it's clear that there's one audit/renewal inspection that's allowed at no cost to the owner, as well as one follow-up, and that's per council motion. And then finally, again, just there's some other technical things that are identified in the memo, but I'm not going to go through them. And finally, on page 106 of the packet, under the sunset provision, per council motion, I took the date 3 years out from the final date that all the properties are supposed to be registered, and that becomes the sunset date, by which council will have to take some form of action to keep this ordinance going. So those are the changes highlighted, substantive changes highlighted, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Questions? Gene?
Peter, is that, so that would be 2016 in 3 years? Is that how that works?
Yeah, January 1, 2016 is the way we had it is that mid-2015, we would have the first half of the city, based on I-5, which would have to have registration, and then by January 1, 2016, the other half is how we had that. And so we took 3 years out from that date and inserted that date.
Okay.
So I had one question under the scope, where you've made some changes under, this is 030. And under number 8, this is a minor thing, but it's more of a definitional thing than anything. This would be on page, scope. This would be on page 96, page 5 of the ordinance. In number 8, it says carriage house units. In a definition basis, a carriage house unit really is the same thing as an accessory dwelling unit, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah. So it would seem to me that, we just strike carriage house units in there because it's covered under the other sections of the ordinance.
I'll verify that. I don't have any reason to doubt that, so I can go ahead and make that change, but I'll double check.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions on Peter's report? Okay. We will, I guess, head it over to another option that would be presented by Mark, and you're on. Mark?
I'm waiting for the cameras to activate here.
The wall is high definition.
It's up and running, but the cameras are not showing the slideshow at the moment. So unless somebody has any technical thoughts on this, it's up and.
Here comes.
Flashing now.
Anybody know any good jokes?
Shutting down the machine now.
Getting closer.
I'm gonna push this because then it won't come. Okay.
Needs an oil change.
Be able to see it here.
Could proceed without it if you would like. It's not that complicated. Maria, I think I'll go ahead first.
Okay. It's coming up. Here. Let me see. Yeah.
Better.
Some art. So I put the things that are important to remember on. Morning, John. Is this your?
That one?
All right, good job, Mayor.
Well, then,
Thank you, Marie.
it's not. You can use after me.
Well, something new every time. That's never happened before, I don't believe. Okay, now we'll start. Sorry about that delay. So I was asked to put a particular proposal in the framework of a fiscal note, just so we've got a basis for comparison and to kind of focus on the broad outlines of the program and its elements. This analysis is preliminary and focuses on the broad outline, not all the specifics, but many of the specifics are actually consistent with earlier proposals and with the ordinance. Not every cost or revenue is accounted for in this analysis at this point, but most of the big ones are. And I'll describe some of the things that are not in there yet towards the end. The basic program features would have 2 FTEs, 1 FTE administrative assistant, and 1 inspector devoted solely to the program. Most inspections would be completed by the staff of this program. Inspections would be by complaint, as is currently the situation. And along with other proposals, there would be an audit sample as well. Fees are set on a per unit basis in this model. Initial assumptions were that the fee would be set at $24 per unit per year, with a reduction in fee for larger buildings. And similar to other proposals, there's a number of exemptions. These are only the ones that really drive the fiscal analysis. There's other exemptions that are less relevant to this look. So the ones that I focused on here are the units getting HUD or government inspections. And so those include the government housing units as well as Section 8 and a few other things that are inspected under state programs, and also exempt from both audits and fees. And I've put a placeholder here for the exemptions. We don't have a precise number yet. We could try to get better estimates, but I believe that 1,000 units is probably on the high side. So that includes units with new certificates of occupancy in the last 4 years, so new construction, and also duplex or ADU units with the owner living on the site. And in this case, the declaration of compliance would still be required, but there would not be a fee in this model. The program phase-in is pretty straightforward. 4 main elements. Registration would start right away in 2015, and payment of fee unless you're an exempt property or unit. Health and safety inspections in response to complaint is an obvious continuity with the current conditions. Declaration of compliance unless it's exempt from that in the ordinance. And inspection of units selected for an audit would start mid-year, reflecting the fact that half of the units would be registered by the middle of 2015. After that, it goes to citywide audits. To just basically show you some of the numbers, there, according to numerous sources, there are approximately 18,000 rental units in Bellingham. Currently, under the prior set of exemptions, approximately 5,000 would be exempt from fees, which leads to about 13,000 units subject to fees. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the cost elements include 2 FTEs, vehicle purchase, and ongoing annual operating costs. Placeholders were added for non-administrative overhead cost. I used the standard placeholder for overhead that the city uses. As the program gets further along in the design phase, there could be some changes to that, but I started with the basic ICAP number being added for admin costs, and I put in a placeholder for computer costs because that's unknown what the actual modification costs would be. I think the assumption would be that there wouldn't be a requirement for this, but I put that in there just to be on the safe side in case there's a need for customization or database creation for the program. Some of the revenues or costs are not yet accounted for in this model. Net revenue from fines or fees for multiple re-inspections are some examples. These are really hard to quantify. These could include some additional revenues to the program, but difficult to quantify, as I mentioned, and probably not very large in total. Another thing that's not in there now is that if there are existing building services staff used by the program to do some of the audit inspections, those could be charged at the current permit center rates. That's not built in there yet because it's just a broad outline of a model at this point. And also there could be legal and court costs associated with enforcement of program requirements, just as with any program the city runs that has enforcement and fines, et cetera. So just to run down a few of the numbers here, the number of units subject to registration fee and possible audits are approximately 13,000, as I mentioned earlier. Costs range from approximately $225,000 to $260,000 per year, and revenues would scale up from $260,000 to $290,000 per year. One of the things I did was I didn't assume that the initial year that 100% of the units were registered, of the non-exempt units were registered. I ramped that up from 85 to 95%, so that's one of the reasons why the revenues change over time. Also, with the appearance at this point of excessive revenues, would cover as yet unquantified costs, and if this difference persisted, fees could be reduced or program activities such as additional audit inspections could be increased. And that is my overview of this, and so I'll take any questions you might have.
Gene?
One real quick. On slide 3, you mentioned an annual audit sample. Does anybody in the room know how an audit sample would work? Are you going to just pick a structure, names? How is it going to be complaint-driven, or how does the audit example work?
Well, I've looked at other programs, and some are pretty careful about just doing kind of a random poll. They've got a database, and there's some sort of algorithm that they develop to do a random sample. Some use a stratified sample system where they stratify by geography. But I think it would be pretty random, and that's the fairest way to do it, and to make sure that you're getting all units and not singling out particular properties for higher probability of an audit. However, under the state law, it is possible if you, for example, were to audit a larger building and you come up with violations, you could then inspect additional units. So in that sense, it could expand from that audit inspection, but I believe that most programs run it on a pretty random basis.
Roxanne?
Not to disrespect anyone or anything, but I just want to make it clear that this was a presentation from one council member, not the full council.
Yes, there's no endorsement of this program at all. I was just asked to put this in this fiscal note framework, which I had been using for this analysis of this program for a number of years, because it does get complicated rather quickly. And if there's a base framework, and Councilmember Weiss was familiar with that framework and asked me to put it into that framework, so we've got a basis for comparison. And plus it allows all the numbers to be flushed out on the table, and if there's any things missing, those can be added in. So that was the purpose of doing that, and my presentation here is just to provide the basic overview of that proposal.
Yeah, I'm the author of this particular option, and the reason why I wanted to put this forward as another option is that the previous options have been, there have been additional bells and whistles that have been put onto it that I think have added a lot of cost to them that I guess we could go through and modify that. But what I wanted to do is, I think, just provide a very low-cost option that would be effective in addressing the specific purpose of why we're even doing this exercise in the first place. And so this was, in essence, hire one building inspector, have that person go out and deal with any complaints that there are in the community for health and safety issues, and then to deal with as available to deal with any sort of audit inspections, and understanding that other communities have a very good success rate of being able to do a number of inspections on an annual basis. I'm not so much hung up on how many audit inspections are done. I just think that it's important to have the resource. And it's different to have a building inspector there versus a code enforcement officer. A building inspector is going out there and inspecting buildings. A code enforcement officer has a lot of other responsibilities, and I think that it would, if we want to pursue that avenue, that we would want to look at the job descriptions of both and see which one is most appropriate to accomplish the tasks that we have in front of us. So that's the primary background of why I wanted to go and put forward a different low-cost, in my mind, effective type of proposal. And I'm just putting that out there for committee consideration. Gene?
Just not to beat a dead horse, but to go back to the audit, if it's complaint-driven and there is a stack that high, wouldn't you kind of lean the audit that way before auditing somebody that doesn't have any problems? That's why I'm trying to figure out how fair the audit system can be.
Well, I think that in reality, if this program were to be adopted, or a similar program, that the profile of the rental issue would go up. People would feel like the city's there and is ready to do something. You would assume that the number of complaints would go up for a while. So that, and that's one of the things that under this model, and I think in the others as well, there's flexibility in terms of deployment of staff. And so I think you would assume at the beginning of the program you would have more complaints than you did have, and that those would dissipate over time. And I think that's what other cities have seen. But so the likelihood is that you would flush out some additional complaint-driven calls to the city, but that over time the audit would sort of replace that as an ongoing monitoring. And if the conditions overall improve, then that would be the primary way of making sure that rental units were in compliance. But the complaint-driven system always remains in place. It's required by state law. And so in that sense, we're not missing that part of the issue as well. It's just there's a separate backup sample audit.
Peter.
I just wanted to follow up, Gene, on your question. So one of the things about the way the ordinance is currently drafted is there really is two separate tracks in terms of the inspections that are required for renewal. Sometimes we refer to those as an audit inspection, but they're really required as part of a renewal. The ordinance says the methodology will be random for selecting those, adopted by a rule, but ultimately it has to be random. And then the complaint-driven piece is already in existence, but it's recognized in the ordinance. And it's important to keep those separate because if there is a refusal to allow an inspection, there is, under state law, a warrant process. So we don't want to sort of mix the apples and the oranges on that. And ultimately, if there is a complaint, there is an intersection, though. If there's a complaint, the city looks at it and finds that there is a violation, you can have a renewal inspection required as a result of that. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
Jeff?
Just to touch on revenues and expenditures a little bit, the information presented by Mark on page 113 of your packet in the table format. I think as Mark highlighted during his presentation, these are extremely ballpark numbers based on some assumptions. Just a couple of observations that I noted as Mark was going through the presentation. I think the numbers can drive up or down pretty quickly depending on assumptions that change and variables that can be added or removed from the equation at any point. So what's important to note, just as staff presented the options 1 through 4 a couple weeks ago, these are ballpark numbers, and they provide the beginning of a framework of what could be or potentially be. 2 quick examples I'll give, and these examples also apply to the numbers that staff presented a couple weeks ago. On the revenue side, it looks like Mark did assume registration scales up over the period of a couple years, so revenues would increase. There would probably have to be some allowance, though, for the larger complexes having reduced rates potentially, as was noted during the presentation. So I'm not sure whether that was included in the potential program revenue.
I actually put it in there, but it's a relatively small differential at this point, and that's really ultimately up to the council and you know, whether it might be administration recommendations on that as well. But right now it's relatively small differential. It's approximately 10% reduction in the middle, and then 20% reduction as you get to the largest units.
So that's where he had mentioned a $20 to $24 annual fee,
right?
And that represented what these.
So there could be some additional flex there. Over on the expenditure side, when we start billing at $107 an hour for additional inspection services, that can also start to run up the expenditures as well. And we talked about that in options 1 through 4 as well. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. But, this model, this option that Mark presented, it's based on what a lot of other communities have been doing. We're trying not to reinvent the wheel, and that's, I think, really important. We don't need to be wasting our time, developing a brand-new model when other models that have been very successful in other communities have been operating for years, and trying to pull not only the operational information, but some of the financial information. And this approach here, you know, knowing exactly how much a building inspector costs or an office assistant costs and be able to plug that in, seems to represent, you know, even though everything in here, everything that we've been talking about is all ballpark until we actually nail down a specific program. To me, it seems like what Mark's done in this fiscal note is something that provides a little bit more meat to any particular option or proposal. So, all right. I'm not sure where we're going to go from here, but other than just additional discussion. Roxanne?
I've had a thorough chance to review this latest proposal, and personally, I'm not in favor of it. I'd just like to share a story about what I've been through with this entire process, as we've all been advocating for our perspectives on how we feel about rental safety and registration. So at the beginning of this, I have been advocating for stronger code enforcement. And that can be a complaint-based system where people could offer their complaints to City Hall. That would trigger an inspection relating to code enforcement or the Landlord-Tenant Act. And so with that, we could have good community education working with our rental community to help them understand that in most instances, the law is on their side. So that's why I advocated for option 1, which is registration only. So what we would do is we would register for a nominal cost all of the rental properties so we know the sphere of what we're dealing with. And then we would use a complaint-based system and strong community education to work with the rental community and with our landlords to help stick to the existing codes, to enforce the existing codes, and also working with Washington State landlord-tenant law. So since I've been advocating for this, we had a meeting with the Building Industry Association and the realtors. You know, generally speaking, they wanted us to do nothing in relation to this. I understand why. But at the same time, I feel compelled that we need to do something. So I was really grateful that, generally speaking, most of them were supportive of this option 1. Then I went on to talk to Western students to see how they felt about this. And what they thought was, this is a good start. Because the good start means that their rental safety is about what's on the inside and the outside of their properties. And also, you know, the Bellingham Herald was kind enough in reporting on our different perspectives on this, and since then I've gained so much positive feedback from community members, from landlords, from Western students about option 1. I just feel like this is the easiest proposal to administer. It's the easiest to understand. It's the most cost-effective, considering the fact that if you have 1 to 4 units, the cost for registration would be $10. There are fears that the cost of the registration would be sent down to rent. So then rental people would have to pay for it. So $10 for a rental increase, I think would be pretty easy to digest if the property owner decided to go that route. You know, and I just also want to say that we're not going to find many opportunities where the rental community and our renters and Western students will agree on an approach. So I think we need to take those opportunities when we get them. And also just saying that so many community leaders, including a former mayor, are supportive of this option. I know that our rental community has fears about retaliation. I understand that completely, but I think we can work on that with community education to really help those people understand that the law is on their side and landlords can't retaliate. Also, let's help people understand that the city is taking a strong stand on these things. So it's not about the person who's complaining, it's about the code that the actual property needs to be upheld to for our community standards and state law. So I just think we have maybe 5% of our overall properties that have all of these issues. Let's address that through code enforcement and complaint-based systems. And I fundamentally believe that after we scrutinize this program and after we take a look at it, we can always add inspections after the fact. This isn't a completely done deal. But I think that actually starting with option one is the best option. Lastly, based on all the community support I've been receiving, people want to see something getting done about this. We can talk about this and bring options forth forever and ever, but I think we need a starting point to really help our community. That's why I am going to make a motion that we move option one to committee of the whole for possible consideration for a public hearing.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. I guess,
Well, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, I was just going to ask a question.
yeah, I was going to ask questions
go
too.
ahead,
Is
go
that, well, I guess first of all, you've mentioned that you've been talking to all these people. I've been talking to people too, and I guess we're talking to different people. You mentioned a former mayor, but you're not mentioning the name. Do you have a name? I mean, if you're going to mention somebody like that, I think it would be in
Yeah, I
context
think
of
that's
this.
less relevant. It's more
Well,
the
then you
fact
shouldn't
that...
be mentioning that, I guess, would be.
Okay, then I'll take it back. This is still widely supported.
Okay. Well, it's interesting, but the thing about you meeting with the BIA and the realtors, you did that through their invitation, and it's interesting that Roxanne, you and Jean and Kathy have been invited to that meeting, but none of the other council members were invited to that meeting. I have never had any invitation by the BIA or the realtors. I have gone to a realtor meeting a couple times now, and I've had the opportunity to talk about this to them and also to the Rental Owners Association. But for them to invite you and not to invite the rest of the committee or to invite the rest of the council, I'm glad that you were able to go and do that. But
Well, at least now
that
you
wasn't
under-
something that I was able to go and do because I wasn't asked.
Well, at least now you understand what their perspective is. It was do nothing or they were comfortable with option one. That was the outcome.
Through you, I haven't had the
As I
opportunity for
understand
dialogue
it, you were
with
also
them.
invited.
I was not
Not
invited.
to that session, but you've been invited on other
I
occasions.
have
to
never
talk
been
about it.
invited by anybody
Okay.
from either one of those
Either
organizations.
way, this is still supported.
I get upset by that because I don't like people going and laying out things like, you should have been there type of thing when the you should have been there has never been actually a possibility. It's not something that I appreciate.
I'm not saying anybody should have been anywhere. We all have had ample opportunity to do outreach about this program.
Yeah. Okay. Gene?
Jeff, option one would be just strictly complaint-driven?
Option one is presented by staff.
It's been
In May.
long time ago, yes.
It was, yeah, I'm trying to think of the date. Would be a registration program and then would continue on code compliance, the way we do code compliance now, and would add additional human resource to the code compliance effort
That,
as requested by the committee.
A
to
code
cost.
enforcer and clerical staff, or just another code enforcer? I can't remember.
It was, yeah, I don't have it
All
in
right.
front of me, but I recall it was just one additional position. And then with the registration-only component of it, when staff considered that as we were moving through those options 1 through 4, we felt with the registration only, we would be able to do that with our existing staff resource in the permit center. That was our conclusion at the time when we put that together.
Can you explain to me, either Jeff or Jim, what the job description differences are between a code enforcement officer versus a building inspector, and what types of skill sets that you're looking for in those positions?
Well, I can, I'll take a stab at it, and Jim certainly will provide color commentary if need be, if I get off on the wrong track. But as I believe we've discussed on multiple occasions in past work sessions, the basic framework of our code compliance system at the city, when we receive a complaint, and this will answer your question, Jack, so just give me a moment here to kind of recap some context. But when we receive a complaint at the city about building without a permit, about some other code compliance matter regarding a code, unless it is a complaint that is an imminent threat to public life safety, we go through a process where If it's building related, one of Jim's staff will work on it. If it's a planning related matter, a planner will tend to it. If it's a public works matter, obviously public works staff, fire staff, you get where I'm going with this. Staff will initially attempt to go out and do a preliminary investigation and achieve voluntary compliance. So that type of complaint and violation would never even get to a code compliance officer. The vast majority of the complaints that we receive are resolved either at that voluntary compliance stage or at a secondary, think of it as strike two stage, where the corresponding department code official will send a letter to the property owner and then work through essentially an enhanced voluntary compliance at that point. What happens is that after going through those first couple stages, or if there's an imminent threat, it goes to more or less strike three, which is where Jim is building code official, Jason Napier is the fire marshal, myself as the zoning official, planning director, will get directly involved, and we may directly issue a notice in order to correct that has appeal rights that come with that. Or additionally, some other type of notice of violation, or worst case scenario from Jim's perspective as building official, to red tag a property or a building, which essentially eliminates occupancy of that structure or property at that moment. So that's when we start to work much more closely with legal and with code compliance over in the police department on those ones, or on those other ones where we work it and we just can't get compliance, and then those are forwarded over to PD, to the code compliance officer, for next steps, which involve a lot of work with legal and going through those mechanics to ultimately try and get some sort of judgment to force compliance on the situation or the property. So that's a basic overview. So to now just quickly delineate out the differences between the code compliance position and a regular building inspector type position. Our building inspectors are out in the field doing building inspections, working with folks that are building projects, and then also they also get involved from a field inspection standpoint on putting together some of the initial facts of a complaint that's received and trying to work, educate and work with property owners to get them in to, if necessary, get a permit to remedy the situation and close out the code compliance case itself. So code compliance, on the other hand, over in PD, they get the toughest of the nuggets, so to speak, ones that we can't achieve other types of resolution towards, or when we get into those very serious notices and red tags and other types of things, they help us out with that. So those are basic differences between the two.
So what I'm hearing from you is that you have this process where if somebody is doing something that is allegedly not proper for health and safety, first you're coming there with a bouquet of flowers and asking them, pretty please. The second step is you're going to be slapping them on the wrist. And the third step is you go to a code enforcement officer with a sledgehammer. That's kind of the way I'm seeing this three-step process of process.
Well, and as I mentioned, when we get those serious imminent threat type violations, those don't go through the bouquet of flowers and whatever the second step was. Those go straight to the sledgehammer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah.
That's, I mean, Jack, that's the way our system is set up.
But you were
That's the way
saying
we've
that
been
most of the complaints that you get are resolved without going to a code enforcement officer. And
They are.
I'm
An
assuming that
an
it's more than
extremely high-
95%.
Yeah, an extremely high percentage of the complaints are resolved without ever making it over to PD. That is a fact. But what's also a fact are the ones that do end up over in PD take a lot of time, a lot of staff resource, a lot of legal input to resolve. They are very, very time consuming. And by the time they get to PD, they've already been very, very time consuming just to get to that point, and then they require a whole bunch more time beyond that. So it's kind of like the 80-20 or the 90-10 rule. It's 80 or 90% of the complaints are successfully resolved without having to go there, but that last 10 to 20% are very intensive, very, very difficult, usually very, very difficult people to interact with, and they just require they require a lot of time, and they end up costing a lot of money.
Yeah, and I can really appreciate that. I guess
If I may
I'm-
add,
go
sorry,
ahead.
excuse me, if I just may add one more thing quickly for context. The police chief, I don't believe the police chief is here this morning, but I think the police chief, if he was here, would certainly feel comfortable in saying that because that final percentage takes so much time and so much energy to work through case by case, there's a big backlog in those types of cases that are sitting over with our code compliance staff over in PD. So, and again, just to flash back to the committee's direction when you ask staff to assemble those options, just as ballpark cost estimates, staff was taking direction from the committee that option one would have the enhanced code compliance aspect to it. So that was the work that we went and we assembled those costs to bring back to you, the committee, at that time.
Mayor?
No, go ahead.
Okay. We have an existing process that some people think doesn't work, and some people think does work. And without, I guess what I'd say is the administration is very willing to look at the way we administer those complaints now, in addition to whatever the council decides to do, because no matter what the decision is, there will be still a desire on the part of the city, I know the council and the administration, that our rental units are safe and that the people that rent them don't have to worry about their health or their safety. So I just want to throw that out there, Jack, that anything we're doing now, some of it might include additional staff, but anything we're doing now, we're willing to examine and see how we can make it more efficient. So I don't think we need to be necessarily stuck on what we're doing. Now, if we have a new system, then we're going to look at how we administer that, and I want it to be very efficient and focus on the 10% that are actually going to cause people a problem. And the time frame is important to me too. So if we know somebody's not going to comply and we give them a chance, because I believe people should be given a chance if it's not in imminent danger. But I don't necessarily know if we have to expand that chance to comply as long as we do. We try really hard to get the quickest response for the renter. So that's still an open question in addition to what anybody else is talking about for options or anything.
Yeah. I'm just really concerned about this code enforcement officer type of position because it seems like it's very punitive. You know, with having a building inspector there, as you were talking about, Jeff, you work with the property owner, you know, you're doing that. With a code enforcement officer, it's you will do this or else, and the or else is usually not very fun. And I see a real disconnect between what we're trying to do, which is trying to present a program that is improving the health and safety of our housing stock. We're going about it in a very punitive way. We call them declarations of compliance instead of something a little bit softer that would, say, we're certifying this building as being properly health and, meets the minimum health and safety standards. But a declaration of compliance just seems to be very punitive. I really am looking at this in a way that, it just seems like it's an overkill with having a code enforcement officer that doesn't have the nexus to rental health and safety. And I guess another question I had for Jeff and Jim is that you said that there's a backlog, and we don't have the PD here, unfortunately. This proposal that, Roxanne, you have your motion on, this is removing the planning department and putting instead the police department, which is not here today, to go yeah, the code enforcement officer is an officer. It's deputized and it's stationed inside the police department. That's what our current code enforcement officer is. And
Go ahead.
Good morning. Jeff summarized fairly well the level of code enforcement, starting with the building inspector, the kind, gentle approach, trying to get a verbal acknowledgement. Then if that doesn't work, it goes to a written format to the owner. If that doesn't work, then it elevates up to the police department. All of that is code enforcement. Our building inspectors don't have the title of code enforcement officers, but even that initial contact is code enforcement. I think that's probably what Roxanne was thinking.
But that's not what this proposal that Jeff was laying out here. It says add additional code enforcement officer. It doesn't say anything about all of the other stuff. It says code enforcement officer, which will be stationed in the police department. Jeff.
So, great conversation we're having here.
Glad you're enjoying it.
Again, staff was taking the cue of the committee at going and putting that position in. If option one is something that the committee is going to discuss further and consider, then one thing you could certainly consider, as I think Jim just maybe indirectly referenced, rather than having that additional code compliance position, you could have an additional inspector position to perform that volume of complaints that we're moving through and the inspections, the initial contacts and so forth. It's just, I mean, it's cost-wise, they're fairly well balanced on our salary scales. So it's not like we're talking, dramatically different things here. Jack, to your point, I think the code compliance officer works in PD, and again, it's the toughest of the tough cases. It's the reason why the sledgehammer is there at that point is because nothing else has worked. It's kind of the final option when they get to code compliance over in PD. And unfortunately, for one reason, another reason, 100 different reasons, we're not able to achieve compliance with all the cases before that moment in time when we have to turn it over.
So I have an unfair question for you, Jeff, or Jim. Because the police department is not here and our code enforcement officer is not here. But the backlog that you have, how much of it is associated with rental health and safety?
Well, you're right. That is an unfair question because it's.
But that is the issue, though, because we're going to set up an entire program based on charging all property owners a registration fee to go and pay for a code enforcement officer that may not even be dealing with rental issues. I'm sure some of them are going to be, but what is it? What's the proportion?
We had previously reported about the percentage of, and again, it was a 2-year sample of our cases, and we manually went through 2 years worth of code compliance cases. This is months ago now we did that, you'll recall. And it was a percentage, I believe, somewhere in the low teens that we were able to say with certainty, to code it to say this is related to a rental property. So we'd have to go and look to see then, the percentage is a subset of that number saying, okay, you've got all code cases, this percentage that we reported on is related to rental properties. And then you have to go through and look and say, okay, the percentage of all cases that go to code compliance, what percentage of those, the number what you're asking for is what percentage of those are related. That's something, I don't know the answer to that question, what that number is.
Yeah. Peter?
Yeah, just to address that one point, I mean, ultimately for a fee to be assessed, those revenues, it would have to be shown that the revenues assessed, that received for that fee are not greater than the amount of the resources dedicated to that program.
Yeah, and that would make sense, and that would be fair. I agree. Gene?
Okay, in order to bring this to a close today and try to bring this thing forward in the proper way, we have 2 motions here, the one that Roxanne made, the one that I made back in May. Was it May or?
Which motion did you make?
The motion that's in the packet. We voted on that. That's why it's in the packet.
Oh, you mean okay, but we've already done that, and now
Yes,
the changes that Peter made.
Yes, and what I'm saying is Roxanne's motion goes directly in because it only takes one council member to make a motion, and that moves forward. So and her option is option 1. Does this one have an option at all, or is it there's no, it was one that I presented, there was no option number on it at all. So what I suggest is we take option 1 and what's in the packet now, put it in the next packet, look at it, send it to the full council, and get this over with finality, one way or another. But my problem is, on June 23rd, I'll be down in California performing a wedding for my niece, and I see people looking at me going, my God, that guy gets to marry people? What's up with that? Huh? But anyway, when's our next meeting after June 23rd?
July 7th.
July 7th? That when it is? Brian's got to be July 7th. Okay, July 7th, then we could go over it. I mean, automatically, both of them go to the floor anyway, because they've both been brought forward, so.
When you're saying both, one is the ordinance and the other is amendment based on what Roxanne is
Yeah, but
proposing
I'm
on the
just-
registration only.
And Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but we adopted a policy a few years ago that one council member makes a motion, and that motion can go directly to the floor without a second. Isn't that correct?
I think you're talking about the lack of a second has to
Yes.
do with you get to vote as a committee.
Yeah, oh, that's right. Okay, I'm sorry.
Because we can vote,
yes,
we can
I'm
vote
sorry.
this up, we can vote it down,
I'm
we
sorry.
can consider other
Okay.
options too.
Well, I'm just trying to bring finality to it because as we witnessed here today, I think it's gone on long enough now, and it's gotten to the point where we have to do something one way or another.
Peter?
And I'm not sure exactly what's being proposed right now, but the one thing I would say, just to echo what Jeff said at the beginning, it would be really helpful to get direction from full council so as not to be performing additional drafts of various options on an ordinance. If you're talking about changing, having like a second ordinance to reflect another option, I think it would be helpful to have that so that we're not spending the time doing that.
Well, yeah, Roxanne's motion is to modify the work that you just did because it's pulling out audit inspections. And so there's a whole section in there, and I'm sure there's quite a few other things in the ordinance that would have to be changed in order to modify to this option 1 with, just registration only. Okay, Kelly, okay, Roxanne?
Just clarity, my motion is to move option 1 to committee of the whole. So that would get
That's-
that full council consideration.
That's why I'm saying if that passes, that goes directly in the packet with the option that's already in there, correct? Without modifying, I mean, you're going to have two separate, I know it's a lot of work, but you're going to have two separate options, right?
And when you say two separate options, you mean two separate ordinances?
Two separate ordinances, the
Okay.
one that's in the packet now and the one that would be drafted up if this goes forward.
We can do that.
That's what I'm proposing. A lot of work's been done so far, and eventually the full council's got to decide whether we move forward. And, it's a possibility it'll move forward with anything. So I just think it's time that we put options in front of the full council, and 'cause I don't think we're going to come to unanimity on any option, to be honest with you.
Jack? Oh, go ahead.
Okay, Kat,
Okay.
actually, Kelly, is it relevant to what we're talking about right now? So why don't we do Kelly first and then Kathy?
Well, it had to do with the idea that we were or weren't going to have a public hearing. Sometimes it's easier for the public to bring testimony to some proposal. I don't like this proposal because it doesn't have this, or I like this proposal because it has this. So I'm just putting that forward. If we're going to have a public, I don't know if you're meaning we're going to have a public hearing, and which personally I think public hearings are good. And then what actually do you want the public hearing to be on? So it's easy for the public to let us know, I like this idea or I don't like this idea.
Well, I would only use the B&O tax on Peace Health as an example. There was two options. That's all I'm saying about this. So.
So you're saying we should have a public hearing?
Yes.
Scheduled, okay, good.
I was just going to ask, is the reason you think we would result in two options out of committee because Roxanne's is a separate idea from Jean's? I mean, Jean's was in the packet that the committee deliberated on, that committee of the whole referred to committee. So it needs to come back with a recommendation, and then Roxanne's would be a separate.
Roxanne is amending the Jean's ordinance, or Peter's ordinance. Well, Peter did the work, but it's actually Jean's ordinance.
Take my name off it, Peter's ordinance. I know, I'm just.
I know. So anyway, we have this ordinance that's in the packet, and the motion is to amend it so that it would remove audit inspections and other types of things that would entertain this registration-only concept.
So far, the only recommendation pending from committee would be to make Roxanne's changes to the proposal in the packet.
So there's only one option on the floor right now. As soon as we take a vote on that, I'm going to introduce another one.
Okay.
And put that forward as well, and we may end up having multiple options to the full council.
But, but there will be, it's a possibility of mixed recommendations, then we just throw it all open to the full council, too, unless we have unanimity.
Don't do
Even
that.
if it's 2-1, it goes to the council as a mixed recommendation.
Yeah.
So, we can sit here all day and put up
Okay.
15 different options, but I don't know.
Well,
Go ahead. I'm just.
let's do that and do two different options.
Go ahead.
Okay, so any further discussion on this motion of adding option one, which is registration only, as detailed in the report that Jeff Thomas had given 2 weeks ago?
That wasn't my motion, though.
Oh, this is a motion to bring to the committee of the whole
Yeah, exactly.
this evening. Okay, Michael.
Just a request for information. It had to do with the abatement fund idea. Is that involved in any, is that gone or off the table? It's not part of option one or part of the current agenda? There's no abatement fund idea included currently?
Yeah, the abatement fund, as I believe we had previously discussed at committee, is a separate matter requiring separate funding. And it's something that the mayor would certainly be interested in having as part of the 15-16 budget discussions with council.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor of this amendment, say aye.
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 Opposed? No?
Well, that's a mixed recommendation.
So it's a mixed recommendation. Okay, I would like to make a motion for option 5 to bring that forward to the committee of the whole this evening. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Nope, mixed recommendation.
Okay, mixed
That comes
recommendation. That
forward.
one is brought forward to the council tonight as well. All right.
Yes, ma'am.
What was your vote?
No.
Okay. Is it possible between now and this evening, just so that we're a little bit more, for my purposes, could you bring a copy of the job descriptions for code enforcement officer versus building inspector 2? Peter?
And just so I'm clear, as it stands, the ordinance as written is not, there's been no motion made on that. That's not part of what's being brought to the committee of the whole.
Yeah, it's a mixed recommendation for the amendments, but we haven't made a recommendation on the ordinance that's in the packet itself, unless.
We already did that. We did that last month.
Oh, you're
No,
talking
we
about
drafted,
changes.
we had just the changes to it, yes. So, okay. You want to move that?
Yep.
I'll move that.
Okay. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No, that passes unanimously. The last motion that I wanted to make was some changes. These are just really minor items. regardless of which version that we go through. It's a motion to amend the rentals, or, well, no, wait, where am I at here? There it goes. Okay, I was on the wrong thing. To move to recommend to the council that the draft rental safety ordinance be amended to include the following: to formally amend the title to the residential rental safety program, to add to section 6.15.1 or .030.b, add electrical systems to the list. That has to do with a, let's see, I'm going to have to pull this out myself here just to make sure that. This has to do with the standards for declaration of compliance and certificate of inspection, and it includes language in here of items that might endanger or impair or could endanger or impair the health and safety of a tenant. The cosmetic conditions do not include affected, and then it goes through a bunch of systems: structural systems, fire safety systems, sanitary components, and weather-resistive systems. The amendment is to add electrical systems into that list. The third is with the registration application. We have certain items that are included into the in the ordinance currently. This amendment would include requirements to state the number of bedrooms per unit, the number of bathrooms, the neighborhood identification, the living person owner's address, phone, and email contact information, versus an LLC that might be there. Another would be the property management, resident manager address, phone, and email contact information, if that's appropriate. The space heating fuel source. Does the tenant pay for gas, electricity, water, and/or garbage removal? That has to do with utility costs and other programs that could be developed outside of this health and safety program. And is the unit exempt from the fee, and if so, what reason? And that has to do with the exemptions that we had talked about before. And lastly, to state that in the section 4, currently, it says under the registration list that the department will maintain a list of rental properties that have a valid registration. To amend it to state that the registry list will be publicly available and include PDFs of the declaration of compliance. That can be modified however the language needs to be modified as legal deems it appropriate. So anyway, that's my motion to do these minor amendments to the ordinance. Any discussion?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Is that stuff we can legally ask? I just asked the legal department.
Well, just going through the list, number one's obviously not a problem. Number two, that language came out of a discussion I had with Jim Tinner in terms of, ultimately, that language is identifying the scope of the standards that are going to be used. Adding electrical systems to that list won't really expand the scope or limit the scope. It won't make any change. I don't know if there's something specific that Jim Tinner had in mind. Okay, so that's fine. Number three, my only concern there is, right now the way it's written is the director has the authority, consistent with the intent of this chapter, to develop the application. It seems like one of those elements that until you get into the nitty-gritty and start implementing, you're not going to know what's best to include in it. But if that's council's wish that, we can include those, it's just a question about whether those are the best points to include and whether there'd be any problems. But right now it's written, those could be included with or without this amendment. And 4 is not a problem.
Okay. Yeah, and in number 3 with the application requirements, that has more to do with policy directive from the council, just to make sure that those items are covered. It doesn't mean that it's not. It's just saying that they should be required, but other things can be also added in there as the director wishes. Jeff?
Jack, just quickly, you left on number 4, you left the door open a little bit as we could modify that language as necessary. And I think I'd want a chance to talk with Peter and a few others about what would be the best language for that item H, the last item.
You mean the registry?
Yeah.
How do you mean as necessary?
Well, that was the comment you made. Once you said number 4, you said that you'd be open to that language being modified to fit into the ordinance the best way. And I would probably like the opportunity to talk that over with Peter and
Yes.
others to come up with what
Yes.
the best language would be.
That's the understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? None? Okay, that's
Can I ask
unanimous.
one more point
Peter.
of clarification. You know, your motions have been to move this to committee of the whole. Are you talking about the full council regular meeting tonight? Is that what the motion is? Because typically that's where you move things from committee. I just wanted to be clear on the record.
That's
on
true,
that.
because the committee of the whole is only an afternoon session. The full council, if we're going to talk about that tonight,
I think it could be for a future committee of the whole agenda. Doesn't necessarily have to be today.
Well, wouldn't July 7th give you time to get everything all put in the packet and everything? I don't know.
Well, you can go one of two ways. One, you can get policy direction that will narrow us down on what we're working on, or we can work on all these options and then bring it forward. That's the ultimate choice, I think, and that's why I wanted to get clarification as to whether you're taking this to the full council tonight to get that policy direction.
The only
But-
reason I caution about tonight is the way the agenda looks now, it's going to be a long evening, and I'm just thinking maybe July 7th would be better. But that's, I mean, it's up to the full council if they want to do it on
yeah,
July.
it's fine. We can report out tonight what happens, and we can either entertain the conversation this evening, or,
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't help you guys, though.
No.
It's easier for us if
Direct
because we
aid.
want to be prepared to answer some of the questions
Right.
that came up tonight and stuff. So I understand what Peter's asking for, which is, I think, a follow-up to, is it help, I mean, would it be, could we narrow it at all so that what the staff is researching for you and what's going to come back on the 7th for a public hearing is you want 2 options or 1 option, and maybe that, at least that much discussion should happen tonight.
Well, technically, we have 3 options that we're bringing forward to the council or committee.
And I wouldn't think the public hearing would be on July 7th, because the full council might not even go for any of it. I'm just
And
bringing
that's,
up.
I mean,
yeah.
that's okay too, but we could at least get direction from the council tonight about how many options the staff is preparing for you. That would be good.
Yeah, to me, it seems like the work that Mark has done associated with option 5, that's pretty much all done. There might need, and the ordinance, the underlying ordinance is pretty much done, except for the minor corrections that we just talked about. The motion that Roxanne made about registration only, you'd have to, I guess, look at that and see if there's, what needs to be done associated with that version.
Yeah, on one hand, it'll be very simple, but it's not going to be completed by tonight in terms of the revisions.
Right. So why don't we agree to report tonight that we would bring this to the committee of the whole at its next meeting on June 23rd? Is that enough time for you to do this work, or?
Yeah, if this work includes making the revisions that you voted on and and option number 1 as an ordinance, yes.
Okay, so we'll do that for June 23rd then. Okay. Any other business? Nope. Okay, we are adjourned.